Our speaker of the day, up the front, Richard Moore, who's going to tell us about one of the most exciting episodes in aviation history. 100 years from when the Vickers-Vimy arrived in Darwin, 10th of December. So if we give a big thought to that. So without any more from me, we'll turn it over to Richard Moore.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I think it is really worthwhile celebrating this. It's the first England to Australia flight, and the story behind it is quite interesting. The fact that it happened in 1919 is also interesting. It's one of several important events that occurred after the First World War. We celebrated one of those with Norman Brearley bringing the first two permanent aircraft into Australia, into Western Australia, at an earlier talk, and so to know a little more about this I think is worthwhile. Now I'm pronouncing this Vimy. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation or not, but the winning aircraft was the Vickers-Vimy, the one shown in that picture. It left Hounslow Heath at 0800 hours on the 12th of November 1919, and it arrived in Darwin at 1610 hours on the 10th of December 1919. The competition. Billy Hughes, one of our more colourful Prime Ministers, was born in London to Welsh parents and was Prime Minister of Australia from 1915 to 1923. He developed a love of flying, probably when he was in Europe for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. On the 10th of March 1919, he announced a £10,000 reward to the first aviator to fly from England to Australia in under 30 days. Valid air crews all had to be Australian nationals. The aircraft had to have been constructed in the British Empire. These are not British Commonwealth days, but British Empire days. The flight had to be completed within 720 consecutive hours, which means 30 days, and be completed before midnight on the 31st of December 1920. Now that was a whole, well over a year after the start of that flight. The departure had to be either from Hounslow Heath for land planes or RNAS Calshot for seaplanes and flying boats. Alexandria to the north of Egypt and Singapore were to be reporting points, and the region of Darwin the final destination. I haven't mentioned this elsewhere, but we need to appreciate that there were very, very few actual established aerodromes even along this route at this particular time. And of course there were none in Western Australia at that time. The flight was to take place under the competition rules of the Royal Aero Club, that's of course the British Royal Aero Club, which would supervise the start and have general control over the competition. It was a competition, not a race. They didn't start the planes off even with a handicap and that kind of thing. It was just a competition. It was whoever was able to fly to Australia in under 30 days. There were 6 contestants that entered. The first one was these are in order of when they left England. The first was the Sopwith Wallaby. It left on the 21st of October 1919 with a crew of 2. They experienced delays due to, first of all, bad weather at Cologne in Germany and Vienna in Austria. They were imprisoned as suspected Bolsheviks in Yugoslavia, and they experienced snow in Belgrade. They had a cracked cylinder head at Constantinople and bad weather at Aleppo. And when landing on Bali on the 17th of April 1920, the Wallaby crashed. The pilot, fortunately, was only slightly injured. The second plane is the one we've spoken about, the Vickers-Vimy. That left at, as we've seen, at 0800 hours on the 12th of November 1919 with a crew of 4 and arrived in Darwin at 1610 hours on the 10th of December 1919, just 28 days later. It was only one of 2 to complete the course. He was the only one to do so within the 30 days. The flight distance is estimated at 17,911 kilometres or 11,123 miles. The total flying time was 135 hours, 55 minutes, and the average speed 131.8 kilometres an hour or 81.9 miles per hour, about the speed of a tiger moth. The third contestant was the Alliance P2 Seabird. It left on the 13th of November 1919 with a crew of 2. It crashed in an orchard in Surbiton, London, about 6 minutes after takeoff. One crew member was killed outright. The other died of his injuries soon after. The fourth competitor, in many ways, had a lot of similarities to the Vickers Viking. It was a bomber, the Blackburn Kangaroo. It left on the 21st of November 1919 with a crew of 4. Charles Kingsford-Smith was originally to have been navigator, but he withdrew. Engine trouble forced the plane down in France. They'd hardly begun. And after repairs, the flight continued, still with engine problems. On the 8th of December 1919, the aircraft crash landed on Crete, ending up against the fence of a mental hospital. The crew escaped injury. The fifth contestant was the Martinsyde Type A. It left on the 5th of December 1919 with a crew of 2. On the 9th of December 1919, the aircraft disappeared near Corfu. The wreckage and body of one of the crew were found offshore, but the body of the other crew member was never found. The final contestant were in the Airco DH9. So that's DH is of course for de Havilland. I'm not quite sure how they are related to each other at that early stage, but this is a DH9. You think of the tiger moths, the DH82, and so forth. It left on the 8th of January 1920 with a crew of 2. In fact, if you look at that, it's got some marked similarities to a tiger moth. The aircraft completed the flight on the 2nd of August 1920, 206 days later, the first by a single-engine aircraft from England to Australia. Although outside the time limit, the crew was awarded a consolation prize of 1,000 Australian pounds. After restoration, the DH9 was put on display in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The PD on the fuselage stands for Peter Dawson, the whisky manufacturer who had purchased the plane and financed much of the journey. The chief pilot, Ray Parra, later took part in the 1934 McRobertson Trophy England to Australia air race. So let's have a look at the Vickers Viking. Its initials, as you would have seen from the earlier photograph, was GEAOU, which they took to be God help all of us. It was a heavy bomber. Its maiden flight was on the 17th of November 1917, about a year before the war concluded. By the time of the armistice on the 11th of November 1918, only a few had entered service and none saw active combat. The Viking became the core of the RAF's heavy bomber force during the 1920s. It was retired in 1938. It had other duties, so that rather than being a heavy bomber by 1938, they did use it for all kinds of other purposes by then, and that was the last time it was in service. In June 1919, piloted by John Alcock and Arthur Brown, it crossed the Atlantic in 16 hours, winning the crew the £10,000 prize the British Daily Mail had offered. So just looking at the Vickers Viking and its transatlantic crew, the Viking had been specially modified. As we mentioned, it won the prize the Daily Mail had offered. They survived a near fatal stall and battled through ice and snow most of the flight across the Atlantic was through thick fog. The overloaded aircraft's exhaust pipe burst, creating so loud a noise that conversation was impossible except through the intercom, which also failed. Their wind-driven generator also failed, causing the pair to lose radio contact and much-needed heating. Alcock and Brown made landfall in County Galway in Ireland. Their aircraft suffered severe damage. What appeared to be a green field from the air turned out to be a bog near the town of Clifton. Neither was injured. They were received as heroes by the local population. They received the £10,000 prize the British Daily Mail had offered from Winston Churchill, who was then the Secretary of State for Air. The Vickers Vimy was powered by two 12-cylinder Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engines. Rolls-Royce as a company had been founded as a luxury car manufacturing firm in 1904. In 1907, the businessman, Charles Rolls, who had increasingly become interested in flying, suggested they build aero engines, but he failed to persuade Royce, who was the engineer, and the other directors. However, in 1914, the War Office requested that they do so. Reluctant at first, in 1915, they built their first aero engine, the Rolls-Royce Eagle. For those of you who know the story of R.J. Mitchell and the Snyder Trophy seaplanes, I think even with the radical new design that Mitchell introduced, I think that the earlier ones had Napier engines, but Rolls-Royce, of course, came into it with the Rolls-Royce Sprint engine later, and of course took the three successive competitions to give the trophy to Great Britain. Now, the crew of the Vimy were four in number: Sergeant Wally Shears, Lieutenant Keith Smith, and Captain Ross Smith, and Sergeant Jim Bennett. Ross Smith, with an MC and bar, DFC and 2 bars, was born in South Australia in December 1892. In 1914, he enlisted as a private in the 3rd Light Horse Regiment. He landed on Gallipoli in May 1915, was invalided to England in October of that year, and in August 1917 he joined the Australian Flying Corps, which had very recently been formed. Here we have two of the Bristol fighters in Palestine, and Ross Smith was mentioned several times by T.E. Lawrence in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Hard Mustard on the left and Ross Smith on the right, preparing for a flight. Ross Smith on the left with Hard Mustard on the right and a Bristol fighter. And here we've got a couple of the Bristol fighters with the handy page 0400 in the background. This painting is in the Australian War Memorial and shows you the situation in Egypt and Palestine at that time. The long journey home. Here's the Vimy with its crew of 4 in the front. The route was by Hounslow Heath, Lyon in France, Rome, Alexandria, which is of course just north of Cairo, Damascus, Basra, Karachi, Delhi, Calcutta, Akyab, Rangoon Racecourse, Singora, which is also Songkhla in Siam, or Thailand as we know it now, Singapore, Batavia, Surabaya and Darwin. The mandatory reporting points are shown in yellow: Alexandria and Singapore. An unscheduled stop in heavy rain was made at Singora, and in Surabaya the aircraft was bogged and a temporary airstrip had to be made from bamboo mats when they were frustratingly close to home and frustratingly close to being under the 30 days. Yeah. There's the route. So it's fairly direct, except for the area around India. And you can see the yellow reporting points, the place where they were bogged, and so forth. So here we have the arrival of the Vickers Vimy at Darwin on the 10th of December 1919. Captain Ross Smith in the centre is talking to Hudson Fysh, right at Darwin, and of Qantas fame. And in Darwin there's a memorial to commemorate the first flight from England to Australia in December 1919. The first airmail letter from England to Australia was carried by Smith and his crew, and the £10,000 cheque signed by the Prime Minister, you can see Billy Hughes, William Morris Hughes, W.M. Hughes there. The cheque was divided between the 4 crew members. Ross Smith and Keith Smith were each knighted for their role in the flight. Wally Shears and J.M. Bennett were awarded bars to their existing Air Force medals and were made honorary lieutenants. The flight south from Darwin took about 50 days, twice the time from London to Darwin, as the port engine, albeit a Rolls-Royce, packed up west of Brisbane. I might add that those 2 engineers had a very busy time keeping those engines in good nick on the flight out. In Sydney, Wally Shears married Helena on the 22nd of February 1920. She died of cancer in 1951. He died of heart failure in 1968. They did not have a family. I mention this because Ross Smith had quite a lot to do with organising that wedding in Sydney. Now, they were both from the same small town in South Australia. And Helena had become very, very frustrated with the fact that she was expecting her fiancé to come back after the First World War. It was 12 months between the fact that they went to India and then later, of course, on the flight out to Australia. And so she'd actually ceased to communicate anymore with Wally Shears. But Ross Smith managed to get a poem to her and persuaded her to come to Sydney, and he was the best man at their wedding. The 1919 England to Australia flight was 8 years before Charles Lindbergh's solo crossing of the Atlantic in 1927, and 9 years before Charles Kingsford-Smith and Charles Owen's crossing of the Pacific in 1928. Ross Smith planned a round-the-world flight in a Vickers Viking, which was a single-engine amphibian, in 1922, with the same crew of 4. On a test flight with J.M. Bennett on the 13th of April 1922, the Viking crashed, killing both crew members. It actually went into a spin from about 1,000 feet, and the crash was attributed to Ross's lack of training on the new type of aircraft and the fact he had not flown for many months. Ross's brother Keith, who was an older brother, accompanied the bodies back to Australia, where each lay in state. Ross's body in Adelaide and Bennett's body in Melbourne. First 3 crew members were all from South Australia, but Bennett was from Victoria. There are centenary celebrations in South Australia. Lainey Anderson is South Australia's Epic Flight Centenary 219 Program Ambassador, and she has written a book, Long Flight Home, which is, I think, readily available. It's a very interesting story. It actually tells things mainly from the perspective of the romance between Helena and her fiancé, and it's very well done. It's a good read. Lainey Anderson wants every child in South Australia to learn the story of the epic flight and, quote, to know that we South Australians can achieve anything if we work hard and dream big. The Vimy, which had been made available by the Vickers Company, was donated to Australia at the end of the flight, and a special area was made for it at Adelaide Airport. I haven't seen it, but still there today, of course. I'd like to acknowledge various websites for the information put together, and Lady Anderson for the long journey home, and Brian Hernan, who already had assembled a number of photos and invaluable information which he put at my disposal for this talk. So I'm very grateful to them for that. Thank you for your attention.